He didn't choose the silence. It was handed down to him like a family heirloom, wrapped in good intentions, passed through generations of fathers who believed that emotions were dangerous territory for boys to explore. They said, be strong, and men don't cry, and suck it up. That's just how the world works, thinking they were preparing him for a harsh reality that would destroy him if he showed weakness. But what happens when that protective silence becomes a prison? What stirs in the depths of a man's soul when he's finally given permission to feel everything he's been taught to bury? Today, we're diving into the psychological wound that has no name, the one carved not by enemies, but by the very people who loved us most. We'll explore the science behind emotional suppression, the philosophical frameworks that explain this inherited trauma, and most importantly, the practical steps toward healing. This is the story of every man who learned that his emotions were too much, too dangerous, too human for this world to handle. There exists a wound deeper than any blade could cut, invisible to the naked eye, yet bleeding in perpetual silence. Psychologists call it emotional suppression, but it's more than that. It's the systematic exile of the authentic self, born not in battlefields or back alleys, but in living rooms and playgrounds, in the gentle correction of a father who says, "Big boys don't cry," and the worried glance of a mother who fears her son is too sensitive. It's carved by playground taunts that echo for decades, "Don't be such a girl," and reinforced by a society that mistakes emotional numbness for strength. We call this masculinity, but what if it's actually trauma masquerading as tradition? What if the men we see walking through life with stoic faces and silent hearts aren't naturally strong, but simply exhibiting learned helplessness in the face of their own emotional needs? In the grand theater of human experience, men have been handed a script they never auditioned for, a role that demands strength but forbids vulnerability, a character that must provide but never need, a hero who saves everyone except himself. Carl Jung, the pioneering psychologist, understood this phenomenon intimately. He called it the shadow, the parts of our psyche that we repress because they don't align with our ideal self-image. For men, this shadow frequently contains the full spectrum of emotions they were taught to fear: vulnerability, sadness, fear, tenderness, and the deep need for connection. What makes this particularly devastating is that the shadow doesn't disappear when we ignore it. It grows stronger, more volatile, more destructive in its underground exile. This isn't about blame or pointing fingers at generations before us. They were doing their best with the tools they had, trying to prepare their sons for a world they believed would destroy them at the first sign of weakness. But here's what they didn't know, what we're just beginning to understand through decades of psychological research. The armor they gave us to protect our hearts also imprisoned them. The very thing meant to make us strong became the thing that made us strangers to ourselves. Every man walking this earth was once a child, full of wonder and questions and an entire rainbow of emotions that painted his world in vivid colors. He knew how to laugh until his belly hurt, how to cry when something scared him, how to ask for help when he needed it, how to say "I love you" without measuring the cost. He was alive in every sense of the word, connected to his inner world with the kind of authenticity that adults spend lifetimes trying to rediscover. But then the conditioning began. Maybe it was the day his father told him to stop being such a baby when he scraped his knee, or when his friends laughed at him for crying during a movie, or when a teacher said boys shouldn't be so emotional. Maybe it was society's constant drumbeat that his feelings were a liability, that his tears were weakness, that his need for connection made him less than other boys who seemed to have it all figured out. One by one, he learned to bury the parts of himself that the world found uncomfortable. First the tears, because big boys don't cry, then the fear, because he needed to be brave and strong, then the need for comfort, because he was supposed to stand on his own 2 feet. Then the confusion, because real men figure things out without asking for help. And finally, the joy, because joy requires vulnerability, and vulnerability had become the enemy. This process of emotional burial is what psychologists call socialization, but it's more accurately described as a form of psychological amputation. We're literally cutting off parts of the human experience that are essential for mental health, authentic relationships, and personal fulfillment. Above this emotional graveyard, he built a man. Brick by brick, wall by wall, he constructed a fortress made of duty and productivity and control. Many confuse this emotional armoring with the wisdom of ancient Stoic philosophers like Marcus Aurelius, Seneca, and Epictetus. But there's a crucial difference. The Stoics didn't seek to eliminate emotions. They sought the wisdom to observe them without being enslaved by them. They practice emotional intelligence, not emotional suppression. What was imposed on generations of men wasn't Stoic wisdom, but emotional imprisonment, a kind of psychological dormancy that masquerades as strength. We applauded this construction, said, "Look how strong he is, and look how reliable he is, and look how he never complains." But inside that fortress, a boy was suffocating, calling out in a voice that grew quieter with each passing year, until it became nothing more than a whisper in the darkness of his own soul. Have you ever watched a man go completely silent in the middle of an argument? Not because he's angry or doesn't care, but because somewhere deep in his cellular memory, a voice whispers that his feelings don't matter, that no one wants to hear this, that he's being too much. What if his silence isn't indifference, but a learned survival mechanism? What if the man who never opens up isn't cold, but simply protecting himself from a world that taught him his inner landscape was unwelcome territory? From the time he could barely walk, he learned that his tears made people uncomfortable. His fear made people anxious. His need for comfort made people worried about his future as a man. So he learned to perform masculinity instead of living it, learned that love was conditional, and acceptance came with requirements, learned that his worth was measured not by who he was, but by how well he could pretend to be what everyone else needed him to be. The question isn't, why doesn't he open up? The question is, why would he? When every time he tried to show his true self as a boy, the world taught him it was wrong. When vulnerability was met with discomfort, when emotions were treated as problems to be solved rather than experiences to be honored, when his deepest truths were consistently invalidated or dismissed. This is the inheritance of silence, passed down through generations of men who were taught that their inner world was dangerous territory. They learned to speak in code, to communicate through actions rather than words, to show love through provision rather than presence. They became fluent in the language of doing, but forgot how to speak the dialect of being. Research in neuroscience shows us that emotional suppression actually changes brain structure over time. The neural pathways for emotional processing can become less developed, making it genuinely difficult for men to identify, articulate, and process their feelings. What society calls strength is often neurological adaptation to chronic emotional invalidation. Remember the proverb? The child who is not embraced by the village will burn it down to feel its warmth. And how does this village burn? It burns in the silence of homes, where love is measured in provision, but not in presence. It burns in the bottles hidden in garages, in the endless hours lost to screens and distractions, in the rage that explodes in traffic for no apparent reason. It burns in the depression that has no name and the anxiety that suffocates without explanation. The statistics paint a devastating picture. Men are 3 times more likely to die by suicide than women. They're more likely to struggle with substance abuse, to die earlier from stress-related illnesses, to experience isolation and loneliness in later life. They're more likely to have their marriages end in divorce, with partners citing emotional unavailability as a primary reason. These aren't moral failings or character flaws. These are the wildfires of men trying desperately to feel something, anything in the frozen landscape of emotional exile. The burning manifests in workaholism, where productivity becomes the only acceptable form of worth. It appears in addictive behaviors, not just substances, but also pornography, gambling, extreme sports, anything that can break through the numbness. It shows up in explosive anger, the only emotion that feels safe for men to express because it's been coded as masculine. It reveals itself in depression and anxiety, the shadow emotions that arise when the authentic self has been buried too deeply for too long. Perhaps most tragically, it burns in the inability to form and maintain intimate relationships. When a man has been taught that his emotional needs are burdens, that his vulnerability is weakness, that his inner world is unwelcome, how can he possibly share that world with another person? How can he build genuine intimacy when he's been systematically disconnected from his own authentic experience? This isn't just individual suffering. This is collective trauma, passed down through generations like a psychological virus. The emotionally exiled man becomes the father who perpetuates the cycle, the partner who can't offer emotional presence, the leader who confuses dominance with strength. The village burns not just for him, but for everyone in his orbit who yearns for his authentic presence and receives only his performed masculinity. But buried emotions don't actually die. They go underground, becoming like water behind a dam, building pressure, waiting for the moment when the structure can no longer hold. And one day, something happens. Maybe it's the birth of his first child, and suddenly he's overwhelmed by a love so fierce it terrifies him, breaking through decades of emotional conditioning. Maybe it's the death of his father, and he realizes all the conversations they'll never have, all the words that will forever remain unspoken between two men who loved each other but never learned how to say it. Maybe it's his marriage falling apart because his wife says she feels like she's living with a stranger, loving a ghost of the man she thought she knew. Maybe it's a health scare that forces him to confront his mortality and question what kind of life he's actually been living. Or maybe it's just a Tuesday night sitting in his car after work, and for no reason he can name, the armor cracks and he feels the full weight of everything he's been carrying. In that moment of breaking, something ancient stirs, something that's been waiting patiently in the darkness of his soul. It's his own voice, the one he buried so long ago, the one that knows his truth, the one that remembers who he was before the world told him who'd be. And for the first time, he asks himself the questions that have been haunting him in the spaces between words. What is the cost of feeling nothing? What have I lost by trying to be invulnerable? Who am I beneath all this armor? This crisis, and it is a crisis in the truest sense, is actually the beginning of healing. Psychologists call it individuation, the process of becoming who you truly are rather than who you've been conditioned to be. It's terrifying and liberating and completely necessary, because the alternative is a life lived in emotional exile, an existence where you survive but never truly live. What would happen if I let myself feel everything I've been taught to fear? This question marks the threshold between performed masculinity and authentic humanity, between emotional survival and emotional thriving. The journey back to himself doesn't happen overnight. It's not a switch that gets flipped or a moment of sudden enlightenment. It's more like archaeology, carefully excavating the layers of conditioning and expectation to uncover the authentic self that's been buried beneath. This process, which Carl Jung called shadow work, involves befriending the parts of ourselves we've learned to reject and discovering that they contain not weakness, but untapped strength. Layer by layer, he begins to reclaim the parts of himself that were deemed unacceptable, starting with small acts of courage that feel monumental in their significance. Maybe he admits to a friend that he's struggling, and instead of judgment, he finds understanding. Maybe he cries during a movie and doesn't apologize for it, discovering that tears don't make him weak, but human. Maybe he tells his partner, "I need you," without feeling like he's failing at being a man, learning that interdependence is not weakness, but wisdom. He begins to question the rules he never agreed to follow, the commandments of masculinity that were imposed rather than chosen. Who said I can't be sad? Who decided that needing help makes me less of a man? Who wrote the script that says my emotions are the enemy of my strength? He starts to see that these rules were never about protecting him, but about protecting others from having to deal with the complexity of his full humanity. Research by Dr. Brené Brown on vulnerability provides a powerful framework for understanding this transformation. Her decades of research show that vulnerability isn't weakness, it's actually the most accurate measure of courage. The man who allows himself to be vulnerable isn't abandoning his strength. He's accessing a source of strength that's far more authentic and sustainable than the brittle armor of emotional suppression. Slowly, he begins to write new rules, ones that honor both his strength and his vulnerability, his power and his tenderness. He learns that courage isn't the absence of fear, but the willingness to feel it fully and act anyway. He discovers that strength isn't about having no emotions, but about having the capacity to feel them all without being overwhelmed by any single one. He writes letters to the boy he used to be, apologizing for the burial, promising that it's safe to come out now. He forgives the father who couldn't show him how to feel, understanding that his father was once a boy too, carrying the same wounds, learning the same lessons about emotional survival. This is shadow integration, not the elimination of difficult emotions, but their conscious acknowledgement and integration into a more complete sense of self. It's the difference between being controlled by unconscious patterns and having the awareness to choose how to respond to life's challenges. Here's what's beautiful about a man who has reclaimed his emotional self. He doesn't become weak, he becomes integrated. He doesn't lose his masculine essence, he expands it to include the full spectrum of human experience. This isn't about abandoning traditional masculine qualities, but elevating them through the inclusion of emotional intelligence, vulnerability, and deep capacity for connection. He still protects, but now he protects from a place of love rather than fear, understanding that true protection sometimes means creating emotional safety rather than just physical security. He still provides, but now he provides presence as well as paychecks, emotional availability as well as financial stability, showing up fully rather than just functionally. He still leads, but now he leads with wisdom rather than just willpower, with authenticity rather than authority, inspiring others through his genuine presence rather than demanding compliance through dominance. This integrated man becomes a safe harbor for others' emotions because he's learned to hold space for his own. He becomes a father who tells his children that their feelings are welcome here, that their tears are sacred, that their fear doesn't make them weak, but human. He models emotional courage, showing his children that real strength includes the ability to feel deeply and love openly. He becomes a partner who can say, I don't have all the answers, and I need you too, and I'm scared, and that's okay, without feeling like he's failing at being a man. He understands that intimacy requires vulnerability, that love deepens through authenticity rather than performance, that his partner fell in love with his humanity, not his invulnerability. He becomes a leader who doesn't lead from ego, but from authenticity, who understands that true power comes not from dominance, but from the ability to remain present with whatever arises. He creates psychological safety for others because he's learned to create it for himself. He becomes a friend who doesn't just try to fix problems, but witnesses pain, who offers presence rather than solutions, who understands that sometimes the greatest gift we can give another person is simply to see them fully without trying to change them. This is what integrated masculinity looks like. Not the absence of traditional masculine qualities, but their evolution through the inclusion of emotional wisdom. It's masculinity that doesn't require the suppression of others to exist, that doesn't need to dominate to feel powerful, that doesn't have to prove itself through emotional numbness or relentless performance. When one man heals his relationship with his emotions, he doesn't just heal himself, he heals the line, breaking the ancestral pattern of emotional suppression that has been passed down through generations like a genetic curse. His healing becomes a gift not just to himself, but to everyone in his orbit, his children, his partner, his friends, his community. His children grow up in a home where feelings are teachers rather than enemies, where vulnerability is recognized as strength rather than weakness, where connection is valued over control. They learn that emotions are information, not problems to be solved, and that their full humanity is welcome and celebrated. They develop emotional intelligence as naturally as they develop language, because they see it modeled daily. His friends begin to feel permission to be real around him, to drop their own masks and speak their truth. They witness a different way of being strong, one that doesn't require emotional armor or the pretense of having it all figured out. His presence gives them permission to explore their own buried emotions, to question their own inherited rules about masculinity. His colleagues see what integrated leadership looks like when it's lived rather than performed, when it's authentic rather than compensatory. They experience what it's like to work with someone who can admit mistakes, ask for help, and show genuine care for their well-being rather than just their productivity. His community sees what healthy masculinity looks like in action, not in theory or philosophy, but in daily life. They see a man who can be strong without being harsh, protective without being controlling, confident without being arrogant, successful without being ruthless. One healed man creates space for other men to heal, and those men create space for more men, and the ripple spreads outward like stones thrown into still water, until we have a generation of boys who grow up knowing that their feelings are not their enemies, that their hearts are not liabilities, and that their need for connection doesn't make them weak, but makes them human. This is how we change the world, one man at a time, one story at a time, one generation at a time. Not through judgment or blame or the rejection of masculinity itself, but through its evolution, its integration, its expansion to include the full range of human experience. If this story is your story, if you recognize yourself in this journey from burial to integration, the path back to wholeness may seem daunting, but healing doesn't happen all at once. It begins with a single step, a single moment of courage, a single decision to honor your authentic experience rather than your performed role. Name what you feel. Begin keeping an emotional journal. Without judgment, simply write, "Today I felt fear. Today I felt sadness. Today I felt overwhelmed." Giving emotions names is the first step in reclaiming your relationship with them. Research shows that the simple act of labeling emotions reduces their intensity and increases your sense of control over them. Find your safe harbor. Seek out spaces where you can say, "I'm not okay," and be met with understanding rather than solutions. This might be a therapist trained in men's issues, a men's support group, or a trusted friend who can listen without trying to fix. The goal isn't to solve all your problems, but to experience being fully seen and accepted in your struggle. Reconnect with your body. Emotions live in the body, not just the mind. Practice body awareness through walking in nature, deep breathing exercises, or mindful movement. Notice where tension accumulates, where emotions show up physically. Your body doesn't lie, and it can be your guide back to authentic feeling. Many men find that physical practices like martial arts, yoga, or even simple daily walks create space for emotions to surface safely. Question the inherited rules. Start examining the beliefs you never chose but have been living by. Ask yourself, who taught me I can't cry? Does this rule still serve me? What would happen if I chose differently? Becoming conscious of inherited patterns is the first step toward choosing your own values and behaviors. Practice emotional courage in small doses. Start with low-stakes situations. Share a fear with a friend. Express appreciation more openly. Admit when you don't know something. Ask for help with a small task. Each act of emotional honesty builds your capacity for greater vulnerability. Seek professional support. Consider working with a therapist who understands the unique challenges men face in emotional development.
look for someone trained in approaches like acceptance and commitment therapy, internal family systems, or Jungian psychology, modalities that honor both strength and vulnerability. Remember, seeking help isn't weakness, it's wisdom. The strongest thing you can do is acknowledge when you need support and actively seek it out.
So, if you're listening to this and something in these words is resonating in your chest, if you recognize yourself in this story of burial and silence and the long journey back to wholeness, this is your invitation. Not to become less of a man, but to become more human. Not to abandon your strength, but to discover that real strength includes the courage to feel everything without being destroyed by any of it. Your silence was never your choice. It was inherited, passed down through generations of men who were doing their best with the tools they had. But now you get to choose. You can choose to feel, to heal, to be the man who breaks the pattern instead of passing it on. You can choose to honor both your power and your vulnerability, your independence and your need for connection, your ability to protect and your willingness to be protected. It won't be easy. The world might not understand it first. Some people might call you soft or weak or too sensitive, but you'll know the truth, that it takes more courage to feel than to numb, more strength to be vulnerable than to be invulnerable, more power to connect than to control. You'll know that the boy you buried is still alive, still waiting patiently for you to come back for him, still whispering your name in the silence, hoping you'll remember that he is you, and you are so much more than what the world taught you to be. The research is clear. Men who develop emotional intelligence live longer, have better relationships, achieve greater success, and experience more life satisfaction. But beyond the statistics is something even more important: the chance to live authentically, to love deeply, to connect meaningfully, to leave a legacy of wholeness rather than woundedness. This is your whisper of self, calling you home to the fullness of who you are. The silence has been broken. The boy has been found. The man is finally free. And in that freedom, in that wholeness, the real work begins. Not the work of performance, but of presence. Not the work of control, but of connection. Not the work of survival, but of thriving. Welcome back to yourself. Welcome back to life. Welcome back to feeling everything. If this message has touched something deep within you, you're not alone. Thousands of men around the world are waking up to the cost of inherited silence and choosing a different path. This is your invitation to join a movement that's quietly revolutionizing what it means to be a man in the modern world. Here's how you can take action right now. First, subscribe to Whisper of Self and hit that notification bell. We're building a community of men and women who are committed to authentic growth, deep healing, and breaking generational patterns. Every week, we dive deeper into the psychology, philosophy, and practical tools for living with emotional courage. Second, share this video with another man in your life who might need to hear this message. Maybe it's your father, your son, your brother, or your best friend. Sometimes the greatest gift we can give someone is the permission to feel, and sharing this video might be the spark that changes someone's life. Third, join the conversation in the comments below. Tell us your story. What resonated most with you? What challenges are you facing in your own journey toward emotional integration? This community thrives on authentic sharing, and your vulnerability might be exactly what another person needs to hear. And finally, if this work is having a real impact on your life, consider supporting our mission by becoming a channel member or checking out our in-depth courses on masculine emotional development. Your support helps us continue creating content that challenges men to live authentically and love courageously. Remember, your healing doesn't just change your life. It changes the lives of everyone around you. It breaks the cycle for your children, creates safety for your partner, and gives permission for other men to begin their own journey home to themselves. The village that didn't embrace you doesn't have to burn. Instead, you can become the village elder who welcomes the next generation with open arms, teaching them that their emotions are not enemies, but allies, that their vulnerability is not weakness, but the pathway to genuine strength.